Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our DAT IQ weekly market update. This is our update for April 30th, 2024, our last update here in April. I'm Ken Adamo, Chief of Analytics over here at DAT, joined by Dean Croak, our Principal Industry Analyst, and very special guest this morning. We have Gary Cornelius joining us. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ken.
How's everyone doing this morning?
We're good. We're good.
Doing well.
Yeah.
I think spring has finally sprung in Ohio. I've got a tan. I've been seeing the sun for 3 consecutive days. I got a little tan rocking. I got some outside yard work done. I didn't have to hire goats to cut my yard. It's a good time to be in Ohio.
Yeah.
What part of the country are you in, Gary?
Well, Ken, I'm based out of Nashville, Tennessee, but I actually work and travel out of my home in North Alabama. So we have
so you're a Crimson Tide fan?
I am, with a daughter who went to Auburn, so certainly a home of conflict.
In a bag of hand-me-downs, so I'm an Ohio State fan and alum, and my son got a sweater from his cousins in a bag of hand-me-downs, which I promptly turned into car washing towels. I wouldn't even let him wear it as a hand-me-down as a baby because I'm on record as not giving a damn for the whole state of Michigan. So I don't know how you did it with an Auburn. I would have ceased payment in that regard.
Well, her saving grace was Alabama didn't offer the degree she wanted.
Oh.
So that was her saving grace, and I gave her 3 rules. I said I won't wear orange and blue at the same time. I won't wear that logo or any insignia, and that phrase that y'all use that starts with W and E will not cross my lips. I said, but outside of that, we'll be here to enjoy this phase of life you're going through.
That you're a better man than me. I have a visceral hatred for the color blue. So, Gary, do you want to give folks a quick intro of your background and what you've been up to before we get into the points this week?
Certainly. Personally, I've been in the industry for 38 years, both on the domestic truckload side of the industry as well as the international intermodal dray side. I've been with TCW a total of 18 out of that. 11 in this stint, and really exciting time at TCW. Scott George, our CEO, sold the company into employee ownership at the beginning of 2022. So we're 100% employee owned. We do about 80% intermodal dray throughout the Southeast United States, 10 to 15% domestic truckload, predominantly in a regional or logistics environment. And then we still do a little bit of the legacy of the company, which is a little bit of warehousing and distribution in the Nashville market. And I say a little bit because 70,000 square feet is not a lot in today's warehousing markets. But so the company's been in business since 1948, celebrated our 75th anniversary last year, and really exciting growth time with TCW over the last 5 years.
Well, we thank you for being on this morning with us. I'm going to get into our key points of the week so we can bring you back in for a great discussion here in a few minutes. All right?
Great. Thanks.
All right. So spot rates ended April, or going to end April, most likely, unless something goes crazy today and tomorrow, as forecasted, flat to down slightly. Produce season kicks off in California with a higher year-over-year volumes, which is a good thing for everybody, both dry van and reefer. The American Truckload Association's contract tonnage index hit 13-month of year-over-year decline. That's down 1% year-over-year, which roughly coincides with the amount of time we've spent with year-over-year spot rates. It's funny how that works. Interest rate cuts move from when to if they'll occur this year with Mr. Powell, Mr. Transitory himself, and the Federal Open Market Committee meet tomorrow. If you're sitting around waiting for interest rates or waiting to refinance, I would suggest you make a cup of coffee or pop a bag of popcorn, whatever you're into, and settle in for a while. It's going to be a bit. That's my non-economist perspective. But with that, I'll turn it over to Dean to actually walk us through the market update. Dean?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Looking forward to catching up with Gary shortly, but let's dive into some of the freight market specifics. Start with the load-to-truck ratio on dry van. Volumes flat last week, sitting about 17% lower last year. That's load post volume. Equipment post reverse course, they were down last week. So the load-to-truck ratio moved up slightly, sitting at about 3.25 loads per truck. In refrigerated, there's some renewed strength in the produce market. That's boosted overall truckload spot market volumes. Volumes up 5% last week. Load to truck ratio up slightly again to about 4.69, tracking as we'd expect this time of the year when produce season starts to move the national needle. And in flatbed, load post volumes continue to fall. Again, down 8% last week, sitting about 18% lower than this time last year. Load to truck ratio down slightly to 16.12. And in the market condition index, look at our top 5 markets, Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, New Jersey, and Atlanta for long haul truckload. The average line haul rate in those 5 markets down a penny per mile last week, averaging $1.50. That's excluding fuel. So these are line haul only. Los Angeles, one of the bigger markets, showed some renewed strength at $1.65 a mile last week on a 5% higher volume of loads moved. Although the state average outbound rate is almost identical to where we were this time last year. Having a look at Dallas-Fort Worth, the general trend in some of our bigger markets last week was higher volumes, lower line haul rates. Certainly that was the case in Dallas and Atlanta. Loads moved were fairly flat in New Jersey last week, resulting in outbound line haul rates dropping by 2 cents a mile to just $1.16 a mile outbound New Jersey for dry van. Savannah, the nation's 4th largest port for containerized imports, saw outbound line haul rates jump by 8 cents a mile to $1.65 last week, but identical to where we were this time in 2019. Some of the lanes out of Savannah, capacity was fairly tight on the 600-mile haul to Bowling Green. We see a lot of volume move on that lane. Volumes were 7% lower last week, but line haul rates are up to $1.21 per mile. In the refrigerated market, looking at some of the USDA data last week, they only reported a slight shortage of trucks in 2 markets, Nogales, Arizona, on inbound imports. Outbound volumes from Nogales were up about 2% last week, but line haul rates remained flat at about 206. One of the top lanes out of Nogales for the Mexican imports of produce is to Los Angeles. There was a surge in volume last week. Volumes are up about 33%. Line haul rates up slightly to $2 per mile. Capacity was tight in Florida last week. Again, not surprising this time of the year in the lead up to Mother's Day. It was also the 26th annual 75 Chrome Shop Truck Show, where a lot of big reefer haulers spend the week showing their trucks and partying in Wildwood. Like the Mid-America Truck Show, this show attracts the same group of carriers. There is a definite increase in market impact. Capacity does tighten. In Lakeland, where the truck show was, line haul rates are up 20 cents a mile to $1.45. Volume of loads moved was up about 16% higher. Further south in Miami, Mother's Day imports are starting to arrive. Line haul rates up 19 cents a mile last week to $1.63. The volume of loads moving was 7% higher last week, northbound out of Miami. So we can expect a lot more activity in the next 2 weeks there. In flatbed, after surging since the Baltimore Bridge collapse, outbound flatbed rates cooled last week for the first time in a month, dropping 19 cents a mile to $2.28, even though the volume of loads moved was slightly higher. In Lakeland, loads moved increased by about 1% week over week. Line haul rates up 6 cents a mile to $1.33. Regional flatbed loads to Tallahassee out of Lakeland up by 13 cents a mile last week to $1.67. One of our biggest spot markets for flatbed is Houston. Loads moved decreased last week while capacity remained tight. Rates up 4 cents a mile to $2.33 for the average of all flatbed outbound to Houston loads. In Pittsburgh, loads moved dropped about 2% last week. Spot rates dropped 5 cents a mile to $2.58. And wrapping up our market update with the year-over-year look at spot rates, the national average dry van line haul rate decreased by almost a penny per mile for the 3rd week. Not significant movement up and down, but definitely more down than up last week at about $1.56. Compared to last year, line haul rates are about 6 cents a mile lower on a 9% higher volume of loads moved. In the refrigerated market, rates were pretty much flat last week, averaging $1.85. As we head into the 2-week shipping peak ahead of Mother's Day, I expect a little bit more upward movement there as we start to see some meaningful produce volumes. Reefer line haul rates sitting about 7 cents a mile lower than this time last year. Loads moved are about 10% higher. And lastly, in flatbed, after being flat for the last 2 weeks, flatbed line haul rates showed some renewed strength last week, up a penny per mile, averaging just over 202 as a national average. That's about 13 cents a mile lower than last year. Loads moved are about 18% higher. So that's it for this week's market update. As always, the long form version of today's report will be published this evening at dat.com/market update, where you can get a copy of some of the commentary and most of the charts. Back to you, Ken, for the short-term forecasts.
Thank you, Dean. Let's spend some time here, but not a bunch. So we have the short terms here. They're 35 days. The blue line is the historical data, which is really interesting. You can start to see that flattening period we've seen pretty much for the last month and a half. It's a 7-day weighted moving average excluding fuel. And then we have 4 forecast models, which are green, ratecast. That's the flagship in all of our products. Red's a short term, which tends to exaggerate seasonality and any short-term patterns it sees. And then you have intermediate models in yellow and gray. And what you're seeing here is, I think, from ratecast, probably the most sound expression of what typical seasonality would look like. If we don't see things behaving like that, I think that's when we start to draw some major concern. The next 14 days or so, when you compare it to last year, is when road check week happened last year. Rates essentially climbed up and stayed there for the duration of the summer. If we don't see that bump this year, I think that's when it's going to become most notable that we're lagging behind on a year-over-year basis. Right now, we're within a few pennies. It's not really that much to write home about, especially with lower fuel prices. I'm going to go to refrigerated. It's the same basic story. Reefer's actually been sliding as opposed to staying constant the last month and a half. I think it's probably the only notable takeaway here, but you're seeing the same expression of typical spring seasonality in all of the forecast models. And lastly, just for some nice model agreement, when we move to flatbed, pretty much every forecast is in agreement in that up into the right trend. You're starting to see a longer term trend here manifest. I think if you draw a nice straight line through dating all the way back to November of last year, you're going to see some polar vortex peakiness in there that would drive model fit down, but I wouldn't be surprised if the model fit of that straight line that you draw through here is probably in that 70% plus range. So I think a real trend starting to form in long-term flatbed recovery, which is positive. So with that, we can turn back to Dean for our question of the week.
Yeah. Gary, so let's start off with a sort of a fairly broad question. You offer, or TCW offers a wide array of services, probably one of the most comprehensive group of services I've seen in the truckload market. In your business, is there any one market vertical that's outperforming the others this year?
So far, Dean, there is. Unfortunately, it's driven by disruption. What we've seen in the ocean cargo side has been almost the perfect storm of disruption for the East Coast. You've got the Panama Canal drought that was happening that was limiting vessels. Then the Red Sea crisis breaks out, really restricting a lot of clients from their normal network. So we're seeing clients bring freight in from different parts of the country. A lot of them defaulted to a pure West Coast in order to maintain the time in their supply chain. But that gets them out of their network. So the one market vertical we've seen really benefit from that disruption has been what we call our dray transload and truck model, where that container is actually drayed to a facility, transloaded to an OTR truck, and moved domestically into the final destination in cargo that was going all the way to door in the container.
So Gary, is that because of the lower cost on the OTR side, or the excess capacity?
It's largely driven by the lower cost, as well as just the fact that when you've got that container, it has to go back to origin. So if you're coming into West Coast, a lot of them see this as a better option than railing it to the Southeast and then draying it, because you still have to go back to origin with that container. So today's truck market certainly avails itself to the longer haul over the road movement than it does the rail movement of that container.
So are you talking about 20 footers, 40 footers, 45s, or is there one in particular that is sort of the highest volume on the import side?
40s tend to drive the highest volume, and I would say 20s and 40s are where we're seeing this most prevalently. A lot of our customers bring in 20s that are heavy, that already transload. where they may take 3 containers and create 4 truckloads.
Hmm.
But now we're seeing that happen outside of their normal network. And what we've been able to do is be an option for them in different markets, whether we have capacity there or not, to provide that service, to try to create as little disruption in who they're reaching out to for their service as they can.
Right. So just to dig a little bit deeper on the disruption point, so are you sort of suggesting that on the import side, the volumes coming into different ports where they don't have capacity on the rail side?
Or where the client doesn't have relationships, where that's not in their network. Let's say you've got an importer in the Southeast that's coming in 90% Savannah, 10% Charleston, or vice versa, and all of a sudden 25% of their cargo has to come into LA Long Beach. Just as any of us in our jobs, they immediately go, what do I do? And and try to figure out those solutions, knowing that it's going to be somewhat of a short term, that eventually these will ease. Of course, there is another possible disruption hanging out there with the East Coast labor talks. There's a deadline coming up in May, and a lot of mixed emotion about what the outcome of that's going to be. So, a lot of them, even though, the Panama Canal is starting to ease, they're having a very good rainy season. They're releasing some of the restrictions they had. I think the Red Sea is going to be with us for a while. We've seen a lot of clients who have had enough inventory. They've been able to digest the additional transit time. But then we've seen a lot of them just out of caution say, I'm going to bring a certain percent in into a different routing that's not impacted by these disruptions or won't be impacted by potential labor disruption.
Did you see any noticeable impact on the East Coast with the Baltimore Bridge collapse?
We had 2 clients that come in predominantly through Baltimore. And I was talking to one of them last week, and they've had a lot of disruption. But most of that is getting covered in New York, New Jersey, or Norfolk. So it really doesn't reach down to our market. We did see some boxes that got discharged that were on the ocean ready to berth. They got discharged as far south as Charleston, but very little impact in the Southeast.
Can you talk a bit more about transloading? It's a data point that we don't have a lot of visibility into. We hear a lot about 40s getting transloaded into 53-foot vans. You mentioned 3 20-foot heavies into 4 53-foot vans or flatbeds, I guess. Can you talk a bit about the ratios on the 40-foot side? Like, what's sort of the mechanics there? And is there a particular type of freight that might be floor loaded as opposed to palletized freight that's easier or harder to transload?
Absolutely. So, on the 40-foot, the ratio is pretty much 1-to-1. Most of the 40-foot containers are ranging anywhere from 32 to 45,000 pounds. So when you start looking at those ratios, then it's pretty much a 1-to-1 with legal limits on a 53. Right. So pretty easy ratio there. Certainly the palletized loads make it much easier. However, we do have some clients with as much as 3,000 cartons on a container that are getting floor loaded and transloaded to palletized to make that move.
Is there a particular length of haul where it becomes less viable? Like, is that, as opposed to leaving the international box intact?
Interesting. We had this conversation with one of my sales managers yesterday. He was trying to present a dray transload and truck model to a customer who's only got about a 300-mile length of haul. What we found is that 500 plus is the sweet spot where the incremental cost of transloading doesn't blow it above what you could do leaving on the container and running it as a container to door move.
So that would be pretty much a one-day drive by truck.
Correct.
From a utilization perspective.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned, so some of the big ports, we've seen a lot more volume come into the Gulf Coast in particular. Are you seeing some of those trends continue on from the sort of the surge in volume, particularly break bulk volume? We had a surge in volume to the Gulf Coast last year.
Certainly. New Orleans is a significant break bulk terminal for this that feeds the Southeast and the Midwest. And, we continue to see opportunities there. Really excited about the traction, especially as an Alabamian, that the Port of Mobile's gotten. And really new leadership driving it to be a significant port on the Gulf Coast. It's a natural deep water port, so it avails itself well to larger vessels. So we are seeing a lot of growth in our Gulf region.
Mobile was always known as a fairly strong import-export refrigerated hub. I think they've got a pretty good infrastructure there for reefers. Is that changed to be?
That's still the case. I will tell you the South becoming little Detroit helped Mobile get on the market as well from a containerized standpoint. Right. And there's a good bit of lumber export that travels out of Mobile as well, both in containerized volume and in break bulk.
Yeah, we're seeing, I'm just pulling up some numbers here. Our year-over-year outbound volumes in Mobile are up about 20% year-over-year. Rates are flat, which is kind of consistent with the total market in terms of, volumes are up, but rates are still flat. So that's interesting. We're seeing pretty high volume. They've been rising steadily for the last 3 years out of there. The automotive industry is fairly strong down there. So is that part of the growth on the inbound side?
Yes, it is on the containerized side.
Yeah.
For quite a while in talking to Mobile, 80% of their volume was automotive. I don't know that percentage has dropped tremendously, even though their volume has gone up incrementally year over year.
Right.
Walmart also did them a big favor when they built an import center in Foley, Alabama, that also boosted a good bit of that non-automotive import.
Right. On the warehousing side, any observable trends there? We had a lot of chat last year about excess inventories that shippers had amassed in warehouses. We're starting to see warehouse occupancy rates climb back up to historical levels, more like getting closer to 6% as a national occupancy rate. What are you seeing on the warehouse side?
We're seeing some of the same. A lot of our clients we're going off to offsite warehouses with now simply because they're full. And they're looking for somewhere to put that inventory. I think there's still a little bit of a holdover too from the crunch of 21-22 when these importers couldn't get their inventory. And they're holding on to more safety stock. However, we have seen some of them get a little more comfortable with pulling that safety stock down. On a call with one of our major importers last week, who said they're at 106% capacity and are looking for outside space right now. So still seeing a good bit of that on the import side. There again, I think the disruptions continue to cause a discomfort that, I've got to keep my inventory to where I can reach it for my manufacturing or my buyer. And the only way to do that is stay ahead of the import curve.
Right. What sort of lead time are they working on from, say, order at the manufacturer overseas to on site in the shelf at the warehouse?
A lot of our clients are consistent standing orders, so they know it's coming out, and they know that inventory is coming out every week. Generally, they're looking somewhere between 40 and 45 days, sometimes up to 60, depending on the manufacturing process at origin. But your average ocean lead time is going to run 22 to 32 days, depending on whether it's European or Asian, and then moving out from there with ground transportation.
Okay, we got a question from Matt Clark, a really good question for you, Gary. Most of the national carriers reported some disappointing 1Q earnings calls last week, as no doubt you've seen some of those. We talked about those before the show. Do you see any sort of rebound in freight this year?
I think we'll see a stabilization. I don't think we'll see a rebound. I think with everything economically, Ken alluded to interest rates a few minutes ago. We are in an election year. That tends to be a little bit of a soft period for us. And what we're seeing and what we're hearing from our clients is expect flat. We have seen a stabilization, but I'm not anticipating a rebound per se until probably 2025.
That's very interesting. We had a similar discussion yesterday on we kind of landed at the same spot. So that's really interesting. That's how you see it too.
Yeah, I think the definition around rebound is going to be the most crucial piece, right? I think if we aren't seeing meaningful progress upwards through the balance of this year, I think we're having a much different conversation. I agree that we're probably not going to see expansion until 2025, but if we're not seeing at least recovery taking root through the end of summer and through the retail shipping peak, I think we've got bigger problems to deal with. That's probably going to be symptomatic of some broader economic headwinds that we weren't forecasting.
As one of the things that'll be a factor in that, Gary, is we talked about it before the show. Gary, a good friend of mine's a dry van operator. He saved $100,000 during the pandemic, and he's still got every penny in the bank. And it's allowing him to run at a much lower rate per mile during this soft period. It's part of the reason that we've got so much excess truckload capacity hanging in the market a lot longer. I suspect there's a lot of carriers out there that paid down a lot of debt and have much lower operating costs this market cycle. So while ever diesel stays where it is, down at about $3.95 as a national average, I think that's going to help a lot more capacity stay in the market this market cycle.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big points. Dean, you and I've talked about this 2 or 3 times over the past few months, is that normally in these cycles, we've seen that attrition. And I do think, you brought that point up earlier, and I hadn't really thought about that side, is that, what the average small carrier was able to bank in 21 and early 22 has enabled them a much longer runway to get through this market cycle.
Yep. Gary, while we've got a little bit more time before we wrap up, you and I are going to the TSMA conference in New Orleans, June 9 to 11, I think. Talk a little bit about that, the 100-year anniversary of this event. That's certainly worth talking about.
We are a member of TMSA, which is Transportation Marketing and Sales Association. It is the only association that has a specific agenda around marketing and sales in our industry. A lot of value there. And we'll be doing a panel we've got Dean and Lee Klasko and Lindsey Burr from American Trucking Association. We'll be doing an economic panel to talk about some of what Ken and Dean have talked about on a weekly basis, and really talk about where this market's going and how we as marketing and sales professionals go to market in these times. So really beneficial organization. I ask you to look into it. A lot of great networking, a lot of great education for practitioners, as well as some really good networking opportunity for sales and marketing leaders. We are probably 70% marketing, 30% sales. But as I jokingly mentioned to Dean earlier, we as sales professionals tend to play closer to the vest. We think we have a secret sauce, but in reality, we're all drinking out of the same bottle. Great networking opportunity to talk about best practices, to talk about what we're seeing in the industry, as well as hear from both economists and shippers about what they're looking for out of marketing and sales. Couldn't be a better place than New Orleans, Louisiana. So the conference is right on Bourbon Street at the Royal Sonesta. So, it's tmsatoday.org. And I'd ask you to take a look at it and join us if you're a marketing or sales professional in the industry.
Yeah. It's the first 100-year anniversary conference I've ever been to. It's certainly rare. Yeah.
All right, Dean, you want to bring us home?
Yeah. We've got Robert Rouse on Landline Now. Tomorrow night, Sirius XM Channel 146. Chris Kaplan's got a great guest on the Freightvine podcast out this Thursday. Mike Bassani from Microsoft talking about how they use AI in supply chain management. Next week's guest is a friend of the show, Nicole Glenn from Candor Expedite. She'll be joining us on her birthday next Tuesday. As Ken mentioned, the RoadCheck week starts in 2 weeks. It's a 72-hour safety blitz. Be prepared. They're already starting out on the highways right now. As Gary mentioned, the conference in New Orleans is on 9 to 11 of June, the TMSA conference, as we've just covered. So back to you, Ken, to wrap up the show.
All right, Gary, how can folks get a hold of you if they want to do some business or talk about the market?
Absolutely. I can be found at tcwonline.com, or my email address is gcornelius@tcwonline.com.
All right. I want to thank Gary for the great conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Hope everyone has a safe week, has a good week. We'll see you back here next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.